Good morning, and welcome to session 2 of Christ Lutheran Church's series on faith and science. Let us begin with a word of prayer. I'm reading from a New Zealand prayer book from the Anglican Church. Let us be at peace within ourselves. Let us accept that we are profoundly loved and need never be afraid. Let us be aware of the source of being that is common to us all and to all living creatures. Let us be filled with the presence of the great compassion toward ourselves and toward all living beings. Realizing that we are all nourished from the same source of life, may we so live that others be not deprived of air, food, water, shelter, or the chance to live. Let us pray that we ourselves cease to be a cause of suffering to one another. With humility, let us pray for the establishment of peace in our hearts and on earth. May God kindle in us the fire of love to bring us alive and give warmth to the world. Lord, lead me from death to life, from falsehood to truth. Lead me from despair to hope, from fear to trust. Amen. Well, thank you for joining us. Our topic today is what actually is in the Bible in the way of science. So let me begin by saying that the Bible is not a science text. It's not a text for mathematics, political science, geology, psychology, French, or any other particular academic subject. As we explored last week, the Bible is a history book. It describes the history of the Hebrew people. It helps to answer the question, where do I come from? For the Hebrew people, for Jesus the Christ. It also gives us an opportunity to consider relationships and gives us a guide for how to have right relationships with our God, with one another, and with ourselves. The Bible does this frequently through the use of stories. Jesus loved to speak in stories, and frequently it was the stories that helped people remember his particular teachings. And the Old Testament is also full of stories. Within those stories, occasionally there is embedded some science. And sometimes that science matches up with our current understandings, and sometimes not so much. Today, we'll take a look at where that science pops up and look at some of the particular Bible stories where that happens. Some of the stories are familiar to us because they're part of our common lectionary and we see them every couple of years. Others are perhaps less familiar, and where that happens, I'll try to tell the story with a bit more detail. Where the story is familiar, perhaps I'll try to put a spin on it that you hadn't thought about before, just to promote some good thinking. And along the way, we'll meet the science that's inherent in those stories. So this is a Sunday school class. This is not an academic class. We began, of course, with prayer. Had it been an academic class, we might have begun with a quiz. And one of the things I thought you might want to read in advance of this class was the story of Noah, as found in the book of Genesis. So here's the quiz that I would have given were this an academic class. Pardon me while I activate the share screen. Here's your quiz for this morning. In fact, I've given you the answer to question 1. The story of Noah is located in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. How many days did Noah and his company spend on the ark? Was it 40, 54, 150, 300, or more than that? How many people were on the ark? 2, 8, 80, more than that? You might want to jot your answers down. We'll come back to these answers later on in the presentation. How many pigs were on the ark? Sheep? Giraffes? How about little things that we don't see or think about? Copies of the polio virus, for example, or even as we think today, copies of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. How many maggots were on the ark? Which of the following is not something that Noah did after exiting the ark? Did he build an altar and sacrifice clean animals? Did he get drunk and expose himself? Did he curse his grandson for something he didn't do? Did he invite a bunch of friends over for a party? And lastly, this is probably a gimme for most folks. What is the symbol of God's new covenant made with Noah? We'll come back to the story of Noah in a little while. Hopefully, you can reflect on your answers, and if you're so inclined, you can even do a little bit of reading while you're on your way. Pardon me while I hit the share screen again. If our technology has worked correctly, you should be seeing a screen that asks the question, what does the Bible actually say about the sciences? Well, I'll begin by confessing one of my greater sins. I taught physics for almost 4 decades, and I'm never one to miss a chance to talk about science, even if I wasn't asked. You might notice that the first jar isn't completely empty either. Here's the topics we'll cover today. We'll begin with a little bit of thermodynamics. We'll talk some about cosmology, and we'll return more seriously to our study of cosmology next week when we explore the particular case of Copernicus and Martin Luther. We'll cover some zoology, some genetics, some anatomy and physiology, and we'll get to the story of Noah and the flood. We'll look at neuroscience and behavior, a science that we don't typically think of when we talk about biblical science. And lastly, we'll talk about living water. So let's start with what I'll call a warm-up exercise. And use scriptural passages to consider the fact that heaven just might be hotter than hell. Now, the 30th chapter of Isaiah has the key parameter to determine the temperature of heaven. What it says is that it will be like the moon as bright as the sun, and the sun as bright as 7 times the sun, for 7 days as one. If you take not one sun, but 50 suns as the source of energy, the 7 times 7 plus 1, and apply some basic thermodynamics, you find that a body experiencing 50 times the energy of the sun would have a temperature of about 525 degrees Celsius. For those of us who speak Fahrenheit, that's just short of 1,000 degrees. Now, the key parameter for determining the temperature of hell is found in the book of Revelation, because it's brimstone. Brimstone is sulfur, and it boils at 445 degrees Celsius. And since the chapter in Revelation tells us that there would be boiling brimstone, that fixes the highest point of the temperature of hell, which means that heaven is about 80 degrees warmer than hell on the Celsius scale, or about 150 such degrees on the Fahrenheit scale. Now, there's another way of looking at the passage in Isaiah that suggests perhaps it's only 8 times as bright and not 50 times as bright. Nonetheless, that would lead to a temperature of heaven of 232 degrees Celsius, or about 400 degrees on the Fahrenheit scale. Wow. That's some cooking. That's enough to really light a fire. And in fact, this becomes my fire and brimstone story for the day. If you ever wish to preach a sermon on fire and brimstone, here are your good reference points. Well, all that talk of fire and brimstone means that we need some ruach. Ruach is one of my favorite Hebrew words. I don't know very many Hebrew words, probably about 5. But this has a beautiful sound to it, and it's also got a beautiful translation. It's a Hebrew word that is sometimes translated as spirit, wind, or even breath. It's the Hebrew word found throughout the Hebrew Bible that we translate as the Spirit of God. Now, in Hebrew, as in many languages, nouns have a gender associated with them. It's true in Spanish, in French, in German, many other languages. Ruach is a feminine noun. The Spirit of God, therefore, ought rightly to carry the pronoun she. Let's now turn to the cosmology of the Bible and remember that little bit about Ruach. Here's Genesis 1. In the beginning, God, He created the heaven and earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God, she moved upon the face of the waters. And the rest of the creation story, which ends on the 6th day when God said, "Let us create human beings in our image." That should be very empowering to all of our people. Now, if I use the information from the rest of the Hebrew Bible, the Noah story, pieces from chapter 1 of Genesis that talk about the dome above the earth, elsewhere where it describes pillars, a piece in Isaiah that describes a circular earth, references to floodgates, etc., we get a picture that looks like this. The earth is a circle in this model. Shug is the Hebrew word. It means circle. Sometimes it is translated in our Bibles as saying the earth is round, but it means literally circular and does not mean spherical. Shug is used in Isaiah. Shug is used in other places. And meshuggah, a circle instrument, is like a compass that a carpenter would use to draw a circle. And that word is used when it talks about the act of God in creating the earth, that it may have been laid out with a meshuggah. So our circular earth sits on the columns or pillars of the earth. There are oceans surrounding it. Sheol, the place of the dead, is underneath. Yes, it's a hot place, perhaps full of molten brimstone, molten sulfur, because even ancient people knew that what came out from volcanoes was hot and liquid rock. And if that's what came out when the earth opened up, that must be what is underneath. The sky is covered by a dome, and there are references to the floodgates, which could open and bring rain, either in moderation or, in the case of Noah's Ark, quite a bit of rain. And of course, if that's going to bring rain, there have to be waters above the firmament, and the place of God is somewhere up there on the upper side. The sun was made to rule the day as the greater light, the moon to rule the night as the lesser light. Even today, there are people who believe that that statement about the moon as the lesser light means that the moon itself must be a source of light, even though it has been well established that the light we see from the moon is simply reflected from the sun. We know that because in eclipses, we see the shadow of the earth on the moon, we see phases of the moon, and indeed, over the last half century, we have had people walking on the surface of the moon and not looking down and seeing a source of light. Given what we know about the moon, we might be tempted to wonder what is meant by this interpretation in the book of Genesis. Martin Luther talked about having a literal interpretation of the Bible, but not a literalist interpretation. And Luther would have been quite content with the story of the moon as the lesser light, because that's what it looked like. And if that's what it looked like, that's the way it was. That's the literal meaning. The literalist meaning would be to suggest that the moon, therefore, must itself be a source of light. You'll find that I will use quite frequently today a more literal rather than literalist interpretation of the scriptures that we see. The stars, the moon, the sun would travel on the dome of the sky in the model espoused by the Old Testament. Now, this picture never appears anywhere in the Bible. The words are what appear, but this is an attempt by one person who has talked about or has tried to describe for us what it all might look like so that we might have a picture in our minds of what the ancient people thought was the cosmology that governed the earth and the heavens. Science of today follows what is called a Big Bang theory, the notion that the universe was created from a single point at a single time. And it's interesting to speculate on where that science came from. It's a 20th century concept put forward by Edwin Hubble, who drew a diagram of the velocity of distant celestial events, supernova, and plotted it as a graph against the distance those were from the Earth. And what he found was that the further an object was from the Earth, the faster it was moving away from us. That's an interesting thought. And what occurred to Hubble is, what happens if you run the clock backward? If you run the clock backward and put all of these objects in reverse, you find that at one point in time, they were all at the same place at the same time. Thus, the origin of the Big Bang theory. Now, it doesn't matter where you might happen to be within that universe. Indeed, you will observe, no matter what your position, that everything else is receding from you. So that's our big picture of cosmology. As I mentioned at the beginning of the class, we'll talk more about cosmology next week when we look at the particular story of Nicholas Copernicus. Let's turn our attention now to zoology. And I want to begin with the story of Jacob and Laban. This is not a story that we necessarily know as well as some other things about Jacob, but it is a story that pairs two of the Bible's great connivers. Perhaps we know of Jacob as such a person. Jacob, you may recall, is the twin brother of Esau, who was born first. But according to the scripture, Esau was born with Jacob's hand grabbing on to his heel. The suggestion many have made about that story is that Jacob and Esau were wrestling in the womb to see who would be the firstborn, because to be the firstborn was quite important. Would not be Jacob's last wrestling match, in fact. Later on, Jacob tricks Esau and buys his birthright from him for a bowl of soup. Esau, feeling that he was getting older, thought perhaps he would have no reason to have his birthright. And so he was willing to sell it for something that pleasured him at the moment. Esau was favored by his father Isaac. Esau was a hairy guy. He liked to hunt. He brought home game. In fact, I kind of have a mental picture of Esau as a character out of Duck Dynasty. Jacob was favored by his mother, Rebekah. He was more of a stay-at-home kind of guy. But I'll remind you, he was a conniver. Because not only did he buy the birthright of Esau, he stole his father Isaac's blessing by dressing up in Esau's clothing. Not surprisingly, Jacob and Esau had no love for one another. It was a concern of Rebekah's that Esau might actually try to kill Jacob. And she made arrangements that Jacob be sent away to her brother Laban. And we meet our second great conniver. Along the way, as he approached Laban's town, Jacob was smitten by a shepherdess. That shepherdess was Rachel, the daughter of Laban. So smitten was he that he wished to take Rachel as his wife. And he made a deal with Laban that he would work 7 years for him, and his wage would simply be the hand of Rachel as his bride. But Laban was a conniver. And when 7 years was up, surprise, Jacob married Leah, the older sister of Rachel. Oops, that wasn't the deal. But Laban said the older sister has to be married first. That's the rules. You want Rachel? Work another 7 years. And so Jacob did. And he also married Rachel 7 years later. Between the two of them and two of their enslaved maidens, they bore Jacob 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel that we now know of later. Well, as Jacob began to have a really big family, he started to want to look after it for himself. And he asked Laban, if we were to part, what could I have as my wage? I need to look after my family. And the deal was, you can take from the flock goats that are spotted and speckled, and lambs that are dark. But the pure colored ones would belong to Laban. And then Laban, trickster himself, took all the spotted and speckled sheep or goats and dark lambs and moved them 3 days away from where Jacob was. But Jacob had the last laugh. Jacob knew a little genetics. He knew how to breed sheep and goats in such a way that he could produce the coats that made the strongest of the sheep and goats his, and the weakest of those sheep and goats Laban's. And alas, he made off with the best of the flocks. Knowing a little genetics sure helps a lot. Knowing the dominant and recessive genes, sort of sounds like an experiment you might have done with peas when you were in high school to mimic the experiments of Gregor Mendel. It happened much, much later. But there's a bit of genetics all the way back in the book of Genesis. Let's turn to anatomy and physiology. According to the Bible, the heart really is the source of life, and much of thinking and emotion happens in the heart and not the head where the brain is. We now know that the source of emotion is in the head, although we still use the feature of the heart as a source of emotion in much of our language. Anatomy and physiology is referenced in the holiness codes. The cloven hoof and chewing the cud are the means for determining which are the so-called clean animals that can be eaten by the Hebrew people. Getting the life blood out of meat is what makes it kosher, and thus there is only a certain way that meat is prepared in a Hebrew family. Now, the Bible doesn't always get everything correct. Ostriches are mentioned in the book of Job, where it talks about them abandoning their eggs and offspring, unlike people. Actually, ostriches are incredibly loyal parents. And there are other occasional oopses in the science that comes up in the various stories. But by and large, the Bible does a pretty good job of getting the anatomy and physiology correct. Finally, let's turn to our story of Noah as our third example of what's going on in zoology. But we'll cut to some other sciences as well. You may know the size of Noah's Ark, 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. You can almost hear Bill Cosby asking, what's a cubit? A cubit's actually about 18 inches. It's the distance from here to here on an adult male. The engineering details, a boat about 500 feet long, made of wood, would probably crack in the middle under rough seas, and indeed, in the amount of rain taking place during the flood, the rough seas would have been rather incredible, and it is likely that something made of wood, even the strongest wood, would not have survived. But to introduce some zoology in there, everything that's on the boat, the Ark, needs to breathe. There's a 1 cubit ventilation hole for all those animals and people. And it's not just a question of the inputs. What about the outputs? We don't usually talk about those in a Sunday school class, but the methane buildup from many, many days worth of many, many animals with a 1 cubit ventilation hole would not have wanted to light a fire, because that sucker would have blown up. Fish would not have survived the Great Flood because the pressure of the incredible depth of water would have crushed everything at the bottom of the sea. And the temperature at the top, not to mention the lack of salinity, would have made survival of saltwater fish impossible. Now, let's turn to our quiz. Did you know you're Noah? The answers are kind of complicated. Indeed, the reason is because the story that is told in Genesis 6 through 9 is actually 2 stories mashed together. The website that I've shown on your screen actually divides the 2 stories, and I'll let you reference it later on. You may want to stop this recording if you are watching from home and look up that source. You'll find that on one side, the story talks about the flood happening for 40 days and 40 nights, at the end of which Noah sent out the dove, and after 7 days it came back empty-handed, and after 7 days it gave a clear signal that the waters had receded. So perhaps after 54 days aboard the ark, Noah and his company were able to leave. But in the other story, what is called the priestly version, Noah and his company are on the ark for the better part of a year because the rain is 150 days. There's another 150 days for things to dry out, etc., etc. And when you add it all up, wow, they're there a really long time. On one side of the story, Noah is asked to carry one pair, a male and a female, of every kind of animal. On the other side of the story, Noah is asked to take 7 copies of pairs of the clean animals, but 1 copy of the pairs of the unclean animals. So either way, there's 2 pigs. But maybe there were 14 sheep. Giraffes. Trick question. Are giraffes clean animals? Yes, they chew the cud. They have a cloven hoof. They're one of the 10 official clean animals available to the Hebrews. So there would have been 14 giraffes. Now, you're not likely to find giraffe being served at the next bar mitzvah you attend. Perhaps it has something to do with how to make the kosher cut in order to prepare the giraffe for consumption. The story of Noah and the ark is interesting. Probably more than half of the church nurseries in North America are decorated with some version of the story of Noah's ark. Cute little pairs of animals, the ark dancing upon the waters, the rainbow that becomes the sign of God's new covenant with Noah and his successors. Wow. Such a cute story. But you know what? This isn't a children's story at all. It is perhaps the most gruesome story of annihilation ever told. What did it look like from the ark to see floating bodies of people and animals going by? To see drowning people trying to cling to the side of the ark in hopes that they might be admitted and eventually being dashed away. This isn't a kid's story. But it's science. Well, we have covered its science. Oh, by the way, the one thing that Noah didn't do after he got off the ark was have a party and invite over a bunch of his friends. There weren't any of his friends left. Let's turn to our next science. The next science is neuroscience. Science of the brain. How do our brain's interactions with the phenomena around it interact to govern our behavior? What's told in the Bible is quite clear. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your span of life? Sometimes, I think especially today in our world where we are experiencing pandemic, where we're experiencing pandemonium, this cartoon that I saw just on Saturday captures our thoughts. We certainly seem to be in a world of worry. I want to reference 2 books to think about our current scientific understanding of neuroscience and indeed about worry. The first of these is written by a friend of mine, a man named Hank Davis, who is an evolutionary psychologist at the University of Guelph, just outside of Toronto in Canada. His book is called Caveman Logic. In it, he talks about how our brains are hardwired to see certain things, to put certain things together in certain ways And there simply hasn't been time since caveman times to break up that hard wire and have our responses go in different ways. Thus, we are prone to think about things like jinxes. If I wash my car or schedule a golf match, it's certainly going to rain. That's caveman logic, that we can somehow influence that by one of our acts. But within caveman logic, Hank Davis points out that there are two kinds of errors that our brain will make because it never has all of the information it needs. It takes in what we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we feel, and pieces together an image of what our environment might be like. Sometimes we see danger where it doesn't exist. Other times we don't see danger where it does exist. These are the type 1 and type 2 errors. Now it's quite clear that one of those is a whole lot more dangerous than the other in caveman times. If you see danger where it doesn't exist, perhaps you've reacted, but no big deal. Life goes on. But if you miss danger and it really did exist, that's fatal in caveman times. And so even today, we are prone to see danger, to see trouble, sometimes even where it doesn't exist. That's a part of our hardwired neuroscience. Robert Sapolsky is a psychologist that I introduced last week. He wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it's because in their world, to see danger means to see physical danger. And the net result of that is a fight or flight response. What happens when you see danger? Your blood pressure increases. Your muscles tense. Your digestive system shuts down. Your immune system shuts down because the body is totally focused on the moment at hand. To do so maximizes your chances for fight or flight. Now, if our current problem is that the boss has asked for something to be done by 3 o'clock, and it's now 2 o'clock, and it will take you 5 hours to put it together, your response is likely the same. Your response is blood pressure goes up, muscles tense, digestive system shuts down, immune system shuts down, only you don't relieve all of that by taking off for a good run or duking up for a big fight. Instead, you internalize all that stress and it leads to long-term problems. Sapolsky introduced what he calls the stress paradigm. And in one of my favorite of his videos, a YouTube video that I'll not show, but that I've put on the screen again that you can refer to later, Sapolsky talks about the discovery of type A personality. It's attributed to the cardiologist Myers Friedman. But Friedman is the first to say that he really got the hint about it, not from reading the science, but from an upholsterer. You see, Friedman had this problem. In his waiting room, he was replacing his chairs at an incredible rate. And one day a substitute upholsterer came in and said, "Why is it that your chairs look different than the waiting room of every other professional I serve? I go to podiatrists, I go to general practitioners, I go to a variety of medical professionals, and their waiting room chairs are fine. But I come to you and find that the arms of your chairs are literally clawed open. The seat is clawed open. What is it about your patients?" And eventually it dawns on Friedman that the cause of cardiac problem is excess stress and how it's managed in what is called type A personality. Now let's return to scriptural analysis and to a book that many people reference as supporting the verses that I read from Matthew and other places in the Bible. Lucado's book is called Anxious for Nothing. And he talks about the fact that we ought not to be worrying, much the way Sapolsky would suggest that worrying not only doesn't add anything to your life, but probably subtracts from it. Now, in our current environment, I must confess that I worry a little bit about the Max Lucado philosophy because I discovered this. It's a reaction to the book, but it's 2 years old. Philippians 4:6 is a be anxious for nothing verse. The writer of the blog that is referenced here says that this verse is a verse too often preached from a position of privilege. Now, I'll remind you, this is 2 years old. And he talks about what would happen if a Black preacher preached on Philippians 4:6. Well, the parishioners worry about whether or not their brothers, their husbands, their sons will come home each day. What happens if a Hispanic priest preaches on Philippians 4:6 when his parishioners live in fear of deportation or family separation? Is an upper middle class white guy the right person to be saying, be anxious for nothing? Something to ponder in our current times. Finally, I'd like to turn our attention to the subject of living water, the last of the science references that we'll use for today. Rita Haltman-Finger points out that there are over 800 references to water in the Old Testament, but very few in the New. And she gives reasons for that. The ancient Hebrews derived their culture from the East, the desert territories. In the New Testament, the interactions are with Greeks, with Romans, and with the company and territory to the west, in the Mediterranean Sea, a much wetter geography. The book of Acts mentions water with only one reference, and that is to baptism. So what is it about living water? Many of us have favorite scriptures about water. I'll mention a few that are here and let you look those up later if you wish. The woman at the well is my favorite because it makes reference in particular to living water. What is it about water that makes it living water? There's some good science about water that will really help us understand how it can be living water. So let me look at the woman in the well a little bit. This is one of my favorite artistic depictions of living water, of the woman at the well. It is painted by an 18th century painter, Angelica Kauffman. We can see Jesus preaching, teaching, and her eagerly listening. One of the reasons it's one of my favorite representations is because of looking at that painting next to Angelica Kauffman's self-portrait and realizing that she has painted herself as the woman at the well. Have you ever stopped to think about what it would be like to be that person? Have you ever thought of yourself as that person? in the story? There are lots of representations of the story of the woman at the well. Those of my generation will remember what I will call Sunday school Jesus. Sunday school Jesus was actually depicted in the work of Simon Dewey, and it comes from the Church of Latter-day Saints. Yes, indeed, a Mormon representation. Here is Sunday school Jesus having a conversation with the woman at the well. Take careful note of their posture. Take careful note of their positioning. Take careful note of the surroundings. Yes, you'll notice that they are awfully white, but that's Sunday school Jesus portrayed in almost all of the work. Dewey actually represented this twice. Here's one. There's a second. Wow, how different. Now we don't have a conversation between two equals. We have someone at the feet of the other. Jesus is still telling the story of who he is. She's still eagerly listening, but she's assumed a much different posture than in the previous photo. Let me tell this story a little differently than you've probably heard it before. If you remember how it goes, Jesus is the first person at the well. Now, if you were in 20th century or 21st century America and you wanted to meet people, you might go to a bar. If you're in first century Samaria and you want to meet people, you're going to go to the well. Jesus went to the well. Maybe he wanted to meet people. It's noon. That's not exactly the best time. It's kind of hot, but he shows up and he sits there. And a woman comes by. And what's Jesus's opening line? Gosh, it almost sounds like a pickup line at a bar. Hey, buy me a drink. Instead of buy you a drink, buy me a drink. Or fetch me a drink. Almost the same thing. The conversation rapidly deteriorates into, wait a minute, I'm going home to somebody. Yes, Jesus talks about all of the men in her life. Now, that's probably not a version of the story you've heard before. Maybe it'll make you think about things a little bit differently. But sometimes the woman at the well is portrayed as a bad girl. And I don't want to think of her as that. Indeed, Jesus tells this story in a very different way than usually happens. Often when Jesus talks about himself or about the kingdom, he does it in story. He does it in parable. But with this woman, he flat out says, oh, you want to know about the Messiah? I'm that guy. It's me. Quite direct, quite straightforward. And often when Jesus reveals himself to individuals, his response at parting is, whatever you do, don't tell anybody about this. But in her case, he tells her to go and tell people. She is ordained to preach, and she does so. That's living water. That's the woman at the well. Now, let me take a look at living water from a bit of a scientific perspective. First of all, water is the only substance at the surface of the earth that exists in solid, liquid, and vapor phases. And so with freeze-thaw cycles, evaporation, precipitation cycles, etc., there's an opportunity for great mixing. And because water is a universal solvent, and that opportunity for mixing takes place, water becomes the cradle for life. It is no surprise, therefore, that as scientists explore other planets, one of the things they're looking for in terms of a possible opportunity for life to exist is, does water exist in this location? Because the food chain begins in the water. A brief conversation about thermal expansion. Ordinarily, objects expand as they're heated. Every dimension of the object, length, width, depth, increases. Even holes expand as they're heated, which is why sometimes you take a tight lid and run it under hot water, and the hole, the distance between the lid and the jar expands, and you can loosen the jar lid. Gee, you learned something practical today. But water is strange. It is the only substance that for part of its temperature profile, it actually expands when it's cooled. If you get below about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 on the Celsius scale, water starts to expand when it's cooled and when it freezes. This is a phenomenon well known to anyone who's left a beverage in the freezer for too long and come back to find a very, very messy freezer. Because of this particular phenomenon, bodies of water like lakes and ponds freeze from the top down and not from the bottom up, because the expanded stuff rises to the top. We know that hot air, for example, rises. And indeed, hot water rises when it's at temperatures in excess of 40 degrees Fahrenheit. But because water expands when cooled, ice forms at the top of a pond, not at the bottom. Wow. Because of that, life is possible. Life would be extinguished in bodies of water each winter if lakes and ponds and rivers froze from the bottom up rather than from the top down. Because the sources at the bottom of the food chain, the grasses and small things at the bottom of the lake and pond, would be frozen out. And life itself would never have grown in the ponds and lakes. The fish, everything would die every winter. Yes, this bizarre property of water makes it living water from a scientific perspective as well as from a biblical perspective. And now let me move on to the only mathematics that's going to be in our presentation, except for perhaps that little thermodynamics exercise at the beginning. I want to do a probability exercise with you that will lead us to a rather stark revelation. The probability problem goes like this. Assume that you have a bag of 100 balls, well mixed, 70 of them are white and 30 are blue. And blindfolded, you reach in and you pull out 10. On average, how many of what you pull out do you expect to be blue? Yes, this is a probability problem. Yes, this is a math problem. But my guess is that you probably got 3 as the answer, because 30 out of the 100 were blue, so 3 out of 10 are likely to be blue. And if you pulled them at random, that's what you'd expect to get on average. I've written down the equation that you actually did in your head. You probably didn't write out the mathematics, but that's how you got 3. You multiplied 10 times 30 out of 100. Now I want to play the game with water. The numbers are different. The numbers are messier. There's about 4.18 times 10 to the 46th. Wow, that's 418 and then 44 more digits after that. Water molecules on the surface of the earth. Now I want you to think about that as the whole population, kind of like all the balls that were in the bag. A person is about 70% water. So an average sized person from long ago, Jesus, had about 60 kilograms of water in his earthly body. That would be about 2 times 10 to the 27th molecules of water. Think about those as specially tagged balls. That 10 to the 27th out of 10 to the 46th become the special molecules. Now, it's been over 2,000 years since Jesus walked on the surface of the earth. Water mixes pretty well. We've got freezes, rains, evaporations, ocean currents, and the like. The water has mixed up quite a bit over 2,000 years. So now let's presume that we are plucking water molecules at random, and we want to create another random thing, a human, you. To build you, we need to pull 2 times 10 to the 27th molecules out of that group of 10 to the 46th. I'm going to do exactly the same math that was done with the blue balls out of the bag of balls. And to do so, we would multiply 2 times 10 to the 27th times 2 times 10 to the 27th and divide it by 4 times 10 to the 46th. And when we were done, we would find that we had pulled out about 89 million molecules on average that belonged to any particular individual, even the earthly body of Jesus 2,000 years ago. You share, in all likelihood, about 89 million water molecules with the earthly body of Christ. Now, for a scientist, to me, that represents living water. We talk frequently in our church about Jesus being in us spiritually. But for 89 million water molecules, it probably is true that he's in us physically. Not all of us are always happy with our physical existence. We look in the mirror and we're not particularly proud of what our body might look like, especially since we probably haven't been to the barber or trimmed anything, and maybe we've gained a couple of pounds in recent weeks. We may not be really proud of what it is we get to see, but the next time you look in the mirror, think about the fact that Jesus is within you, not just spiritually, but probably even physically. And that's our final lesson for this morning. I invite you to come back next week when we will talk about cosmology. We'll talk about how Copernicus upended the world of cosmology. We'll talk about how Copernicus didn't get in trouble with the church for his work in cosmology, even though Galileo, a little bit later on, would be in big trouble for preaching and teaching Copernican thought. We'll find that the reason Copernicus didn't get in trouble was because of a plucky band of Lutherans. That's our sneak peek for next week. I look forward to seeing you then.